Stay alert, control the virus, save lives. Boris Johnson's new coronavirus slogan might be clear as mud, but its consequences are explicit. The lockdown is over if you're working class. To discuss Johnson's back to work message and the utter confusion surrounding the last 24 hours of ambiguous announcements, I'm joined by Ash Sarkar and Aaron Bastani. How are you both doing?
Good.
All right, how are you?
Very well. I sort of just suffered an hour of Boris Johnson's very, very waffly press conference. I was sort of looking for clips for it, but it's just his answers are all so long and so inconsequential that it's difficult to work out what you can take from it.
It's like trying to keep up with, like, you know, your uncle who's been a heavy drinker for very many decades, and it's that kind of self-contradicting thing all the time, which is like, no, as we've always said consistently right from the beginning of this crisis, but also changing 24 hours ago, you can ask your boss if you're going to go to work, and you should go to work if you can't work from home, and if you are one of my 6 or 7 children's nannies. Like, it's just mad.
He also he has a very strange, I suppose this is why some people warm to him, but he was sort of asked, as we'll talk about, what should people do if they're going to work and they feel unsafe? And he's like, well, I'm sure employers, will understand. It's like, not everyone has only worked for the Daily Telegraph or for as a politician or a mayor. Anyway, in any case, we've got a big show tonight, obviously, because it's been a huge news cycle over the last 24 hours, over the last weekend. We're going to talk about the big practical consequences of the government's new announcements. Also, the messaging fuck up that's taken place over the last 24 hours. Does anyone quite know what we can and cannot do at this point in time? And we're going to talk about Piers Morgan, who owned a Tory MP, Andrew Bridgen, this morning. He's been the surprise hit, really, of the coronavirus crisis. And we're going to finish by talking about Keir Starmer, his latest public address to the country, and also a bit of a policy fail. As ever, we want more people to watch this show, so please share the link, like the video. Now, I want to start by talking about we're going to start by talking about what was undoubtedly the most significant element of Boris Johnson's speech yesterday. It concerns workers and his desire to get them back to work. Let's take a look.
We said that you should work from home if you can and only go to work if you must. We now need to stress that anyone who can't work from home, for instance, those in construction or manufacturing, should be actively encouraged to go to work, and we want it to be safe for you to get to work. So you should avoid public transport if at all possible, because we must and will maintain social distancing, and capacity will therefore be limited.
So that announcement last night provoked absolute outrage, actually, among trade unions and workers, and also the Labour Party, because he was announcing for people to go back to work the following day. And that's what they released in a press release as well. They've sort of said, actually, the advice was for Wednesday, but they told the newspapers the day before that it was for Monday. They told people to go back to work without having yet published the advice about how people can stay safe at work. Now, we discussed last week the fact that even when it is published, what we expect is for it to not be good enough because it will not be enforceable. It's all based on advising employers what they can and cannot do. So if you've got an irresponsible employer and you're a worker and you've got an unequal power dynamic, there's not going to be that much you can do. The other problem here is that who is it that has to go to work? It tends to be working class people, middle class people, white collar workers. They can usually work from home. So, I thought it was going to be more subtle, this change to our stage in the lockdown. I didn't think he was going to be quite explicit in saying this is all about getting working class people to go back to work. But that seems to be pretty black and white. Ash?
I mean, I was absolutely gobsmacked when I saw the statement last night, like a lot of people. One, that it had been sort of predated by briefing upon briefing given to the Mail, to the Telegraph, about lockdown being lifted in a huge way. And then that was very quickly rolled back on. So what you had going into the weekend was this sense of permission coming from the top for people to be a lot less strict with things than they otherwise would have been. And, you know, I went for my walk around East London and definitely saw people mixing between households. You know, the guy in London Fields was selling sangria. You know, that's obviously a sense of real loosening. People aren't being, you know, as mindful as they once were. And then you would think that any sort of decision to get, you know, a huge chunk of the workforce back into their site of work would be accompanied by consultation with trade unions, that it would be accompanied by consultation with, you know, the Welsh Assembly, the Scottish Parliament, with Stormont. And you think that it would also come accompanied by some really clear guidelines on things like wearing face masks in public, for employers and businesses to be able to get their workplaces physically ready to handle the return of workers. None of those things happened. It was just on a Sunday night saying, yep, we want people to get back to work if you cannot physically work from home. So basically, if you work in construction or manufacturing or maybe security or any one of those things which cannot be done from a laptop and an internet connection, and we will give you zero support to do that safely. Absolutely none. And so from the images that we've seen this morning, where London is just packed out in terms of public transport, and this is a fraction of our total workforce, just remember, it just makes you think, what are they playing at? You can't tell London, a city where over 50% of the workforce commutes by bus and or rail every day, oh, just do something else. I don't know, roller skate, get on your bike, walk.
I want to bring Aaron in a moment, but first of all, I think we can get some footage up actually of what the tubes were like this morning, because one of the more, I suppose, almost bizarre elements of Boris Johnson's speech yesterday was he said you should go to work but not use public transport, and didn't give any advice as to how that might be possible. And that's obviously the case for people who live in London. And so it was, you know, it didn't take a brain surgeon to work out that those tubes were going to be packed this morning. And as we know, it seems as if actually that public transport is potentially one of the most dangerous places in terms of the spread of coronavirus, because you're in an enclosed space. And actually, tragically, bus drivers have been, it's turned out to be one of the most dangerous jobs of all, of any jobs that you can do in the midst of a coronavirus crisis. I think the fatality rate of bus drivers is higher than anyone who's actually working on the NHS front line. So we're talking, this is a serious health risk, forcing people to go back or encouraging people to go back to work, which, if your boss wants you to go back to work, is essentially forcing you to go back to work, could cost lives. Aaron?
Yeah, the thing about London, I think, is really interesting, what Ash is saying. There's this, predictable cliche about, oh, the London metropolitan elite. As Ash has said, many people in London, for better or worse, I think for better, actually, use public transport. I personally think public transport is a great idea. In this particular instance, in this context, it isn't, but generally it's good. Many people take buses and they take the underground to get to work. And actually, as those images showed, I think from Canning Town, was it? Primarily BAME, primarily working class people. And I don't like to go on about, the intersections of race and class, but it's visually there. It's hitting you right between the eyes. 65-70% of the country gets to work, they'll be driving. They don't have that kind of problem. So in fact, it's the complete inversion of what's being articulated by privately educated Harry Cole, who's worked at Guido, who's worked, I believe, at The Sun, who's now at the Mail on Sunday. Rather than this being the metropolitan elite pontificating to the country, it's actually relatively affluent people, such as himself, who don't live in London, saying that actually working class people, particularly working class people of colour, should get on the bus, get on the tube, like it or lump it, do as the boss says, and to hell with you if you get sick or even if you pass away. I couldn't be more sickened by that logic. And like you say, the fatality rates of bus drivers with NHS staff, I think we've had 200 plus NHS staff die. We're going to get to a point where we have more NHS staff, more public transport workers dying from this thing than died service personnel that died in Iraq and Afghanistan. That's going to happen. Where are their monuments going to be? Where are their memorials going to be? Because right now, rather than that being the topic of conversation, we've got Fleet Street's finest mocking them and actually doing the complete opposite of what they're doing. Rather than lionizing them, they're besmirching them and representing the victims of this crisis as somehow a gilded elite. It makes you sick.
Yeah, I mean, background for that, Harry Cole, who works for the Daily Mail, yesterday was tweeting that anyone concerned about the request for people to go to work without public transport was just repeating or echoing the concerns of the metropolitan elite because more people outside London drive than inside London. It's obviously a completely stupid and bizarre point. I want to get up the broader rebranding of the advice, and we're going to discuss in detail the whole stay alert issue in a moment, but the clarification and the new broader advice which is given to the government, which is given to the public, by the government. We can help control the virus if we all stay alert. So stay at home as much as possible. Work from home if you can. Limit contact with other people. Keep your distance if you go out 2 meters apart where possible. Wash your hands regularly. And if you and anyone in your household has symptoms, you all need to self-isolate. Now, what's interesting here is all of these phrases where possible, if you can. And I mean, if you're looking at this, in a positive light, or if you're trying to be sympathetic towards the government, you could say this makes sense. They're just saying, people can use their own judgment at this point in the crisis. But the bigger issue is that that's not really how society works. So if you tell people stay at home as much as possible, and if your boss tells you have to come into work, then that means staying at home is no longer possible, right? So by making it also conditional and also vague, ultimately what you do is you take away the rights of people to stay safe and stay at home because they no longer have an excuse and a justification to do so, according to what the government are telling you to do.
So look, people have got the intellectual capacity to make good choices. We're not coming at this from the perspective of you have to be nannied and you've got to be baby fed and your hands got to be held all the way. It's an acknowledgement that people make those choices within severe constraints, particularly if they're precariously employed and on a low wage. And we've seen this even through what has so far been the peak of the crisis, where call centres remained open, even when there were multiple staffers getting sick, multiple staffers ending up in the ICU, and even tragically dying. And that happened not because those staffers didn't know any better, but because they were dependent on a wage. And it didn't happen because their employers didn't know any better. It happened because they had the latitude to not put money into keeping their staff safe. So we saw that during what was supposed to be the most severe portion of this crisis and under the strictest lockdown measures that we have seen so far in this country. So when you give that kind of latitude to a far bigger range of employers, and in particular those kinds of industries where you've got a lot of self-employed, contracted workers, particularly in construction, what do you think is going to happen? Especially these, very watery and weak source instructions. They're not statutory obligations, they're guidelines. So how are these things going to be enforced? Now, if our media was on job, which, surprise, surprise, they very rarely are, you would have had things like, Section 44 of the Employment Rights Act being raised by Nick Robinson today on the Today programme, where he would be fulfilling his public service remit and saying to workers, you have the legal right not to work in an unsafe environment. And I think if we'd had a leader of the opposition who was on job, you would hear him encouraging people vociferously to join a union and stand by unions when they're defending their workers who refuse to work in unsafe settings. We haven't seen either of those things happening. So while, yes, I think that the lobby is turning a bit on Boris Johnson today because of just how awful these guidelines are and the complete comms mess that's led up to it, we're not seeing the kind of pressure being exerted on the government, which I think will secure the real concessions that could save lives.
We're going to go to Keir Starmer's latest intervention towards the end of the show. First of all, Lauren, I want to go to you with a question, which is, why is this happening now? So, I mean, the government would like to suggest that this is because of they're being led by the science, and this is the particular phase of the epidemic we are in. But I mean, in a way, I think they're almost a bit too embarrassed to make that argument, because it's so nonsensical, the idea that you're allowed to have someone around your house if they're your cleaner, but you're not allowed to have someone around your house if they're your daughter, for example. So that's the new advice, is saying cleaners can go back to work as long as they don't currently have symptoms, but you can't visit both of your parents at the same time, or you can't even meet both of your parents at the same time outside. Like, this is clearly not scientific led, so it's got to be economic. And then if it's got to be economic, there's two different options, I think. So one of them is that it's the construction industry and the manufacturing industries are heavily lobbying the government so that they can continue working, because every day, lost from production is the day of profits that they've lost. And the other option is that they've decided the furlough scheme has become too expensive, and the government have already been briefing that tomorrow they're going to announce a change to the furlough scheme, which is potentially going to reduce people's wages people's subsidized wages from 80% to 60%. The purpose of that, somewhat unclear. Is it to encourage people to go back to work? Is it to save money? But I mean, what do you think is the process driving this quite sudden shift, actually, in terms of emphasis and people going back to work?
Well, what I found interesting actually was that, this is common sense. That's all you need to do, is use your common sense. Everybody seems to be forgetting that the Prime Minister himself was hospitalised. If it was so simple and readily comprehensible, why was Chris Whitty, Matt Hancock and Boris Johnson all subject to this virus? And it was only the Prime Minister at the beginning of March who actually said, look, I will never stop shaking people's hands. Where was his common sense? And yet now it's self-evidential to millions of right-wing Tory supporters that obviously we should get this advice. Can the university-educated left stop pontificating to the rest of us? It's self-evident how simple this is. Well, if it was that simple, we wouldn't have 30 to 55,000 people dead. In terms of why this has happened, when it's happened, I think there's a few push and pulls. One of the pushes is reality. Like you say, the furlough scheme is going to cost between 40 to 50 billion. It's already been extended by a month. In Rishi Sunak and the Tories' defence, we know that it was probably going to go from 80 to 60. That's been touted for a few weeks. That's probably going to be the announcement tomorrow, is a kind of a slow de-escalation from 80 to 60 to 40 to 20. You'd think it would just make more sense to beef up job seekers allowance and universal credit. Apparently not. That's one of the factors. We're going to run a 14% deficit this year. They don't want a 20, 30, 40% deficit. Okay, so that's one of the pushes. One of the pulls, like you say, Michael, is the donors, the newspaper editors. If you're the Daily Mail, if you're the Sun, if you're the Telegraph, and you're saying, look, another 2-3 months of complete lockdown, we have no newspaper left. You're going to make that very clearly known to the Prime Minister. If you would like our support for the next 5 years, you have to do this. And so there's many factors going many ways. Yes, it's the construction lobby. Yes, it's a bit of manufacturing. Yes, they probably want to get a bit of tax take to go up. They want to spend a bit less. There's the newspapers lobbying them. But ultimately, you see Nicola Sturgeon when she was saying, you have placed a great deal of faith in me as the First Minister of this nation. And that means I cannot say with a hand on my heart, this is the correct course of action to pursue. Very simple, comprehensible argument to make. I've heard stories of people that work in car dealerships, social media agencies, turning up to work today and thinking, is this really necessary? Should I really be doing this? Even employers. Now, I don't mean owners of those businesses necessarily, but bosses, line managers. Am I meant to be doing the right thing? Or even if you were a boss, Ash just talked about that earlier on. Well, these are guidelines, right? Well, if your competitors are doing it, you're out of pocket, they're taking business, and you think, well, they're doing it, maybe I should be doing it too. And this is why, no, we shouldn't be depending on common sense and guidelines, because when it's literally matters of life or death, actually negligence goes to strict liability. If I'm a construction company, I employ a bunch of people and 50 of them die in the next month, in a way, I'm pretty clearly responsible for that if they die because of coronavirus and I said they have to go back to work. There's going to be all manner of litigation, legal cases, and so on. And the manner in which this is being done by the government, and we were talking about this on WhatsApp last night, Michael. I'm very underwhelmed by Keir Starmer. I thought it was a bit better tonight. We'll talk about that later. But I think the scale of this crisis now and the scale of this mismanagement by Boris Johnson in particular is spectacular. Spectacular. 30 to 55,000 deaths. And I honestly think we're nowhere near the worst of this. I honestly don't think we've had the single worst day yet of fatalities, which is just, wow. How has this been allowed to happen in the world's 5th largest economy?
We're going to go on to talk about the controversy, specifically about the messaging. Is it too vague? First of all, we've got over 2,000 people watching tonight, but we want to get that higher. So make sure you share the link right now. Also like the video. For the last 8 weeks, we've become accustomed to hearing one simple slogan: stay at home, protect the NHS, save lives. For the loosening of the lockdown, the aim of the government seems to be to get people back to work. So they've had to reassess that. They've had to come up with a new slogan, which we are all going to get very used to seeing plastered across our TV screens for, I mean, it could be weeks or months. We don't really know. But we'll get that up now. The slogan you're going to keep seeing: stay alert, control the virus, save lives. So it is pretty vague. It's been heavily criticised by, among others, Nicola Sturgeon, First Minister in Scotland. So we're going to start this section by looking at her speech yesterday.
I'm asking all of you to do things right now that are not normal in everyday life, and therefore I have a duty to be able to be clear to you about what my messages to you involve in terms of what you can do and what you can't do. Stay at home except for X, Y and Z is a clear message, and it's one that I think allows you to make the judgments about what you can and can't do, should and shouldn't do. I don't know what stay alert means. Presumably we all live our lives in normal times staying alert to danger. But if I say to you my message now is stay alert, and you say to me, but does that mean I stay at home or not? I can't give you a straight answer to that. And therefore I am failing in my duty to be clear in terms of what I'm asking you to do.
So the claim there from Nicola Sturgeon is that stay alert is just not clear enough a message. Everyone knew what stay home meant. It meant stay at home, unless I think they gave us 4 reasons that we could possibly leave the house, didn't they? Now it's just stay at home if possible. And the government have given us loads of options for what stay alert might mean. Stay alert by following the rules. Stay alert by staying at home if possible.
No. Like, the sentences make even less sense than the ones that you just said. It's stay alert by washing your hands. Stay alert by staying at home as much as possible. So grammatically, this doesn't make sense. These are not sentences which are legible in the English language. So I don't know what the fuck is going on. If there was some graphic designer that was out of work and needed a job to, I don't know, out of some kind of favor, and they were like, yeah, you know what, just play around with the slogan and you can fuck about with the colors a bit and that would be fine. You've gone from something which everyone could understand, right? Top line, stay at home. And why are you doing that? Oh, you're doing it to protect the NHS. Why do you want to protect the NHS? Oh, to save lives. Boom, it follows through. You've got stay alert. You can't see it, say it's sorted, an invisible microscopic virus. It's not an unattended bag on the train. It's not going to rock up to you wearing a bally, asking if you can get your phone out so it can see the time. It's not a human threat. And so then you've got something which you physically cannot do. You cannot be alert to an invisible virus. If you could, it would never have spread. Second, you've got control the virus. Now, with what? A lasso? With a cattle prod? With stern words? How am I as a human supposed to think about what controlling the virus means? It's not my job to control the virus. It's Public Health England. It's the health secretary. It's the chief medical officer. And then, you know, of course, you've just got this complete weakening of the overall strategy as it feeds down to the public. Now, this isn't just a comms snafu, and this is what annoys me a little bit, is that the lobby are reading this as like, oh, terrible comms. That's not competent. Well, look, bad comms is, you know, accidentally using a word that you shouldn't use, or accidentally calling your teacher mum when you're in year 3. This is absolute negligence when it comes to the duty of care that the government has towards the public. Because in a crisis, your communications need to be 2 things simultaneously. One is accessible, right? So the maximum number of people should know as quickly as possible at any given time. So this kind of dribs and drabs briefings that we've been getting over the last few days, you know, the idea that we're going to have to wait a whole, you know, nearly 24 hours to see the actual guidelines which are being published, as though rather than them being guidelines which are meant to protect all of us and save our lives, it's the opening chapter from a novel with Booker Prize ambitions, right? That's not maximizing people's knowledge as quickly as possible. And the second thing is that it's got to be understandable. It's got to be comprehensible. People have got to know what it is they're actually doing. The government has failed on both counts. Now, this doesn't just mean like, hoo-hoo, a bad day for Team Johnson. I imagine Dominic Cummings is, feeling pretty embarrassed right now. No, it's not about this Westminster game of who comes out on top. The people who lose are all of us.
Now, Ash, some people, not me, some people would accuse you of performative stupidity, pretending to not understand something to own the government. I'm going to get up a couple of examples. So one of them is Matt Warman, Minister for Digital Infrastructure. So he said on Twitter yesterday, "Stay alert quite obviously means remember to obey the rules. Vast majority of constituents get that and why it's important. Very clever people on Twitter, not so much, apparently." And
well, I do understand.
First, I'm just going to get up Ian Collins, talk show host at Murdoch's Talk Radio. He took a similar line. So he said, "This message couldn't be clearer. You would have to be a grade A moron not to understand it. For reasons unknown, large swathes of the internet, mostly the media metropolitan intelligentsia, are almost having a coronary in faking their incredulity."
Well,
Ask your defense.
Well, no, I mean, thing is that I can actually see the point that's being made by, the MP and the talk radio guys, that I'm sure the two of them have never had to pretend to be stupid in their entire lives. The authenticity is just there. It's complete bollocks. It's complete bollocks. If you look at the fact that today you had huge numbers of people going into work when apparently it was so obvious that we were supposed to wait until Wednesday, is that all of them being stupid or your instructions being stupid? When you've got, Nicola Sturgeon, who is a clever woman, saying, "I don't know what stay alert means." When you've got friends of mine who are counsellors texting me and going, "I've had like a dozen people ask me what the hell stay alert means. Doesn't mean that they can see their families. Doesn't mean they have to stay at home." Maybe everyone in the country is just so much stupider than the Tory party. Maybe they really are our genetically superior overlords. I'm happy to accept that. In which case, perhaps, modulate your instructions to deal with the fact that you're having to instruct a whole load of, intellectual potatoes over here. And you've got to tell us things which are clear and which work. If your instructions don't work in a pandemic, it's not a failure of the public, it's a failure of the government.
All right, I'm going to get up a bit of evidence and I'm going to go straight to Aaron. So YouGov found out that actually the public were also struggling to understand this messaging. So they asked the percent of Britons who feel they know what each slogan, well, this was obviously not the question, so this is their tweet. The percent of Britons who feel they know what each slogan is asking them to do: stay home, protect the NHS, save lives, 91%. Stay alert, control the virus, save lives, only 30%. So we've gone from 9 out of 10 people understanding what the slogan means to 3 out of 10. Aaron, what do you make of all of this?
Yeah, I think the stay alert thing actually serves a really important political purpose. I don't think it's just, it may be a comms error, but for me, a comms error is Joe Biden repeatedly using the word intercourse. That's a comms error. This, I think, is a very intentional political intervention, which is to individualize risk and to individualize blame, to depoliticize this. And what you've seen repeatedly, I saw it today on Twitter repeatedly, was people saying, look, it's down to individual responsibility. People have to be responsible for their actions. And actually, Tom Harwood from Guido Fawkes was saying this. And I said, Tom, okay, well, given the only solution to this in the long term is going to have to be vaccines, how do you propose that works through individual responsibility? And he said, well, people shouldn't be coerced. And by the way, you idiot, nobody's coerced to take vaccinations at the moment. The response being, well, we haven't had between 30 and 55,000 people die of smallpox or tuberculosis since March, but okay. And even now, there is this dunderheaded approach which says personal responsibility comes first, personal freedom comes first. And then when you say, how are you going to administer between 40 and 60 million vaccinations when we finally have these vaccinations? They say, well, people will freely choose to do it. So you've still got no plan. This is the end point, by the way, of the right-wing libertarian ideology. There is no such thing as the state There is no such thing as public administration being able to solve a crisis better than the market. They sincerely believe this. And the most troubling thing of all is it isn't just little gobshites like Tom Harwood on Twitter. This ideology reaches to the very top of the British state. I don't think conservatives is a word for these people. You know, conservative means a number of things. Thomas Macaulay put it best: conserve so that you may endure. Conserve so that you can keep things the same, so that don't make big steps forward, and society will improve incrementally. That's not the animus that drives the modern Conservative Party. They are driven by a zealous, dogmatic ideology which says at all times the state is bad. It can never do things more effectively than the market. Right now, that looks increasingly like a murderous ideology. And I don't say that lightly, because when you have serious opinion makers who go on the BBC and Channel 4 and Sky, people like Tom Harwood, saying that a program of vaccinations in response to a virus which has already killed maybe more than 50,000 people in the last 3 months, when they're saying this should be down to personal responsibility, you seriously have to ask questions. How many people are going to have to die before they change their tune? 100,000? 200,000? Because that's the kind of number we're going to be looking at if this absence of social and political vision continues from the government.
We've got a couple of tweets on the hashtag Tisky Sour. So Anna tweets, absolutely, Aaron. Johnson's mishandling has been spectacularly bad. Surely he's limping along, badly wounded. Do you think he'll survive? Quick answer.
Yes, of course he'll survive, because the media, the government are driven by what increasingly resembles a murderous ideology, and the media have absolutely zero interest in holding them to account. In fact, there's vast sections of the print media that want the government to go further, faster, because what matters most to them isn't minimizing the number of deaths, isn't minimizing the infection rate, isn't the fact that we're going to have far more NHS staff die in the next several months than the service personnel died fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan. No, what matters most to them is that they can meet the bottom line, keep on running their propaganda and selling papers across the country. That matters far more to them than serving the public interest. So what does that mean? It means when people say buy a paper, you reply, for what end? To be lied to? So that the government can be outridden by right-wing billionaire press barons to send us all to our graves that little bit sooner? No. I don't think Boris Johnson will resign over this, and that's fundamentally because we don't have a media which is in any way congruent with one you'd expect to see in a democracy.
We've also got Rusty Sleeves with a £10 super chat. Finally got my universal credit through state paid media. Thanks for excellent journalism throughout this crisis. Keep up the great work. Thank you so much, Rusty Sleeves. It means the world. And also congratulations for finally getting your universal credit through, because we know that the state seems to do everything in its power to make people give up before they get that first check. So well done for the perseverance. A high profile figure unimpressed by the government's new advice is Piers Morgan. Morgan's rise to be a credible journalist, holding the government to account instead of someone getting into pointless arguments with vegans every morning, has been one of the more surprising developments of this coronavirus crisis. He took Tory MP Andrew Bridgen to task this morning on the ambiguities in the government's new social distancing guidelines.
OK, can I go and see my two sons I haven't seen in 10 weeks? Can I go and see them today and maintain 2 metre distance? Yes or no?
As far as I would be concerned, I do not speak for the government. As long as you maintain social distancing in what you do, okay, that will not allow
the problem, Andrew Bridgen. You see, what you've just said is completely against the new rules, as stated. So there you are, a Conservative member of Parliament who thinks you know exactly what Boris Johnson has been saying, and yet you've just told me to do something I'm not allowed to do. So this is the problem, isn't it? There is no clarity. It's a load of old flannel talking about controlling the virus, and you, as a leading, high-profile Conservative politician, haven't got a clue about what these rules actually mean. And you're an MP. You're part of this.
So was Andrew Bridgen a performative metropolitan elite pretending to not understand the guidelines, or are the guidelines genuinely confusing?
Well, I'd like to read you very quickly 2 tweets which were tweeted less than 2 hours apart. One from Sam Coates, who works for Sky, and one from Nick Eardley, who works for the BBC. Sam Coates, new guidelines. Dominic Raab said you could meet both your parents in the park. No doubt more from government later, right? So that's a pretty big thing. You can meet 2 people in the park while socially distanced. That is a pretty big statement and a change from all the things that we've been told so far. Less than 2 hours later, 1 hour, 20 minutes later, in fact, clarification from UK government: you can meet 1 person from an outside household in park if you follow social distancing. You cannot meet 2, such as both parents at the same time. Applies to England only. So I don't think it is a product of my North London tribalism to go, that is confusing government messaging. And clearly, even, Vox Populi, man of the people, Andrew Bridgen, also finds it confusing. And he's had his head untroubled by the lived experience of, Haringey, Tottenham, and Enfield, such as myself. It can happen to the best of us. The terrible thing is that he's allowed to go out onto national media. Piers Morgan's got a huge platform and mislead the public. Now, if it wasn't for Piers Morgan being on top of it and being able to highlight that confusion, but were it any other broadcaster, and dare I say it, were a host on BBC Breakfast, would the public have ended up with that pretty critical knowledge? I would say no.
Did you see that BBC guy? What's his name? Dan something.
Yeah, he was saying, I let them on my show and they get to speak and I don't interrupt them. It's like, yeah, that's probably a bad sign.
Yeah, and he's like, oh, you don't need to shout. No, you don't need to shout. But so when, let's say we get to 250,000 people have died, what are you going to do? Whisper? What are you going to do? Sort of, smile and say, that shouldn't have happened, perhaps. You're talking about 250,000 people dying. That's kind of the ballpark figure we're looking at now. I mean, if you're not going to get, a bit of a sort of more, an escalated tone when 250,000 people die. I mean, when's it going to happen as a journalist? Serious question.
That's a good point to go to our next clip, actually, which is the rest of that exchange with Piers Morgan, because he really does take Andrew Bridgen to task, and it is quite something to witness. Let's take a look.
Piers, I did hear your diatribe against the Prime Minister earlier on. What you've got to
when you say diatribe, let me explain what my diatribe is. We have, according to the government's own graphs, and you can spin them any way you like, the second worst death toll in the world, and that's just the deaths that we're declaring at 31,000. The real figure, according to any detailed analysis of the ONS figures, is over 55,000 people. It's an absolute national disgrace when you compare it to almost any other country in the world. We've had no testing. Our Deputy Chief Medical Officer said we didn't need testing. It wasn't appropriate, so we stopped doing it, which was a total scandal. We've had no PPE for the NHS frontline workers and care home workers, which is why over 200 of them have died. It's an absolute national disgrace. And when you come on and say, I heard your diatribe against Boris Johnson, the diatribe is because so many people have died and so many people are continuing to die.
So, I mean, none of us at Novara Media have been particularly big fans of Piers Morgan. He's normally the kind of guy who actually takes quite right-wing talking points against, what he calls identity politics and is really trying to stoke a pretty unpleasant culture war. But during this coronavirus crisis, he really has been the TV journalist who is best at holding the government to account. And I suppose I want to go to you, Ash, first, because I know that you've met the guy. You've had quite a few testy exchanges with Piers Morgan. What do you make of his rise to become, I suppose, one of the most credible TV journalists in the country? What's going on?
Piers Morgan is a very able man, and when he wants to, he can be incredibly good at being across detail. He's clearly an aggressive questioner. He's a hostile interviewer. You're not going to get a kind of Michael Parkinson, this is your life from him. And on a day-to-day, that can be really exhausting because you have to kind of concoct micro events which can rile him up and get that kind of clippable TV. But I think that when you give him a matter of international importance, he is capable of really rising to the occasion, and he has done so here, so credit to him. I am not what you would call your archetypical Piers Morgan fan. I would say that I've had more than my fair share of run-ins with him. But credit where credit's due. He is one of the few broadcasters taking their public service remit seriously. Now, I entirely agree with Dan Walker. You don't have to be a kind of shouty interviewer. And we've seen with, interviewers like Andrew Neil that you can be incredibly thorough, incredibly rigorous, and not have to raise your voice even once. So the question is, why aren't more broadcasters doing it? I would say it's because they've interpreted their role as being one which has an active role to play in minimizing the chance of social unrest during a national crisis. And I think if you have a look at that email, which I think was leaked to The Economist from the BBC, where they talked about, broadcasting as a state endeavor, right? And not necessarily a public one. Now, this is nowhere in the BBC's charter. So that indicates quite a profound shift in what they see their role as being. It's not to hold the government to account, but to minimize and control public anger.
Aaron, are you now a Piers Morgan stan?
Me and Ashton, actually, we've had sort of behind the scenes debates about Piers Morgan before. I think he's probably in recent years been one of the most corrosive figures in the public sort of debate in this country. But why I've not defended him, that's not fair. I don't think he's party political. And I think he's as big an opportunist as he is a narcissist. And Ash is absolutely right. In a context of a national emergency like this, I think that's actually quite good. And I think she's also right. It's a really keen piece of observation, I think, from her, actually, is that his personality type, the way he acts, in normal times, it kind of is a bit deranged. He has to find a new story, a new angle, something to get, enraged about almost every day. I mean, that's clearly not what life is meant to be like most of the time. However, in a political, moment such as the present one, it's an incredibly useful mindset to have as a journalist. And he's taken risks before. I'm not a fan. He started life out as the bizarre columnist at The Sun. So it's really the lowest of the low when it comes to Britain's print media. Maybe the cartoonist at the Daily Sport was a bit lower, but that's debatable. But then he went to the News of the World, I think, briefly. He made his name really at the Mirror, where he's the editor. And he, of course, famously published what we now know to have been fake photos of Iraqis being tortured by coalition soldiers. In any case, that was actually happening. It was in sort of wide circulation amongst journalistic circles, and he took the risk of publishing it. So I don't think he's ever been wary of making enemies. I don't think he's ever been wary of, breaking with the line that's kind of all pervasive in his industry. He's done that before. He's clearly doing it now. Ash is right. Why isn't it happening more elsewhere? I think it does boil down fundamentally to the fact the BBC has 80% of, radio and TV broadcast news market share in this country. So yeah, there's a little bit of sort of soft entertainment on ITV. There's maybe Channel 4. There's maybe ITN News at 10, Dispatches. But really, there's not much of a space outside the BBC for this kind of journalism. And I do think it's an indictment that the outstanding TV journalists throughout all of this hasn't just been on ITV, but has also not even been on a hard news program. I really think that says something. And we need to take a step back as a country and say, why isn't it both we talk about press all the time, we talk about print media all the time. Why isn't our broadcast journalists, sort of journalistic industry in this country doing better? And I think it's partly about the BBC. It's not to blame the BBC, but clearly in moments like this, having an institution of its size, with its market share, with its remit, right, which is there's a national crisis, we need to ensure that people pull together, there's not public disorder and so on. I think you probably almost certainly do need to have that as an institution. Should it have 80% of news market share? No, I don't think it should. I don't think that's congruent with the kind of media you would expect in a liberal democracy.
We've got we've had some super chats coming in, so thank you for those. We always appreciate those. That goes towards our journalism at Novara Media. One of them is from Jason Dugenis. I hope I pronounced your name right. With a €10 super chat, says, in Greece we didn't have guidelines. We had clear laws, clearly communicated and strictly enforced. End of. That's why it worked. Rob tweets on the hashtag Tiskisour. It's not any number of deaths which will force the government to change their tune, and we cannot rely on the media to do it either. It has to be us. I agree with you there, Rob. We're going to move on to Labour in 1 second and the kind of opposition they've been offering, and also a bit of a policy flop they made. But first of all, on the topic of confusing government messaging, I just wanted to briefly bring up this part, because it really is, my favorite, just because it is so nonsensical. So this is the working they've showed, how they're going to work out whether or not we should move up or down in terms of how strict our lockdown is. So we're going to get up it's a tweet from Boris Johnson, but it's a government graphic. So apparently, the sums that the scientists are going to be doing is COVID alert level equals R, rate of infection, plus number of infections. Now you look at that from a distance, like, oh, okay, that looks scientific enough. That kind of makes sense. I can see why each of those things are there. I can see why rate of infections is relevant and why number of infections are relevant. But now let's actually do that sum, right? So rate of infection, that's the R figure. We know at the moment it's somewhere between 0.5 and 0.9. Initially, it was about 3 when the government was still dragging their feet about whether or not to go into a lockdown, and that's why many people will die, many people did die. So let's get it back up again. Sorry. So R is between 0.5 and 0.9. Now, the number of infections, so we presume that's the number of infections in a day. So yesterday, the Department of Health and Social Care announced that was 3,923. So let's add those together. And COVID alert level is somewhere between 3,923.5 and 3,923.9, which sounds confusing enough. But then we realized that COVID alert level actually has to be a figure between 1 and 5. So you've got this sum that adds up to almost 4,000, and it has to go between 1 and 5. I think we can get that scale up. I mean, with this, they really are just taking us for idiots. I mean, why make it, like, if they're trying to persuade us they're being led by the science, why make a piece of fake science and put it in the most important spreadsheet that the government are going to make this, not spreadsheet, sorry, PowerPoint that the government are going to make this year? It just doesn't make any sense to me.
I mean, it's because they've underfunded the education system for so long. They think we're all that dumb.
Potentially.
I think that's what it is. I mean, so one, this like the Nando spiciness scale, like we're currently somewhere between medium and hot peri-peri. We're trying to get into the lemon and herb territory, if not mango and lime. That's exactly where we want to be. It's a scale which was only created to be able to quickly and clearly articulate to the public where we are right now. Right? It was invented for today. And they've still managed to put us in this liminal place between yellow and orange. So by its nature, it's not clear. It's like, oh, we're somewhere around here. We're in some kind of transitional state, right? So that's not clear. You've got this sort of, there's the hard science undergirding our, COVID alert level. I still find alert hilarious. And I think, just to quickly refer to something that Aaron's been saying, is that under neoliberalism, the state can't do anything. The one place where the state is allowed to do lots of things is terrorism. So you have to use the language of terrorism and heightened alert and security to justify state intervention into, these areas of public life. Now, not every day war on terror. Sometimes have good healthcare system, also maybe. But, this thing of, it's the R number plus, new infections. Well, we don't have an accurate sense of what our R number is, because testing's still a mess. Still struggling to get testing to care homes, and results have been absolutely shocking. People have been waiting well over a week to get their results. Compared to, Wuhan and South Korea, they got testing results back within a day, in some cases 4 hours. So we don't have an accurate idea of what our number is, and we haven't had government transparency in what our R number is before it became convenient to ease our lockdown restrictions.
Yeah, and I mean that's, on a serious point, that's the most worrying thing here, right? When they've made it seem as if they are much more in control of the situation than they are, because some of this, obviously that sum would never make sense, but this next phase of the lockdown might make sense if you had contact tracing in place, if you had mass testing where you weren't having to send, how many did they, I think it was 50,000 they sent over to the United States to get tested there because they didn't have capacity here. So if you had all the capacity to actually do what they're saying they would have to do, then I'd be more relaxed about a loosening of a lockdown than I currently am.
I'd be racing you into the studio, Michael. Wild horses could not keep me away. Like, I think that people, because they've turned this into such a culture war, the right have. They've been stereotyping the left as pro-lockdown, pro-authoritarianism. We don't ever want to go back to work. Well, look, abolish work, inshallah, techno-utopia, all of that. But I'd actually really quite like to see all of you guys. I really miss you. I would really love to be able to go, to Amsterdam and see my students and teach face-to-face, because that's what I love to do. I'm dying to get back to work. Now, there are conditions to that. And those conditions are, am I going to be endangering anyone by doing the thing that I really want to do? Right. And so it's not really about whether or not I get the virus. It's about whether someone next to me on the bus or next to me on the tube has got severe asthma, or they're caring for an elderly relative, and I unwittingly pass on the virus to them. So that's the first condition, is, do I have a safe way to get between where I am and where I want to be, where I can be as sure as I can be that I'm not going to infect anybody. Right. Then there's, do I have the ability to keep myself safe when I'm at work? Is there a legal obligation for Gary, our lovely head of video, to do a COVID-19 risk assessment and be open with what the measures taken are, in line with some kind of government statutory obligation? And if I am worried that I'm getting sick, or Michael, maybe you are, or Aaron, maybe you are, I need to know that you guys can get tested very, very quickly, and that you'll have those test results back as soon as possible. And I also need to know that there's proper sick pay, that there's proper support for people with caring responsibilities. Those are the conditions for getting back into work. I'm dying to get back into work, but I'm not going to work just to die. And that's the thing, right? The left aren't the sort of stereotype of, we want lockdown forever because we really like, Netflix binge watching and authoritarianism. No, it's just we want people to not have to risk their lives for a payslip. It's that simple.
Aaron, do you want to come in before we go to Labour?
Let's talk Labour. I mean, I think the thing about 1 minute, this is just like the Blitz. The next minute, it's kind of leftist, authoritarianism and chill culture warriors pushing it. I mean, make your mind up. If you're one of these batshit right-wing people who somehow inevitably will end up on BBC Question Time when we return to it with a crowd, please, I'm begging you, make your mind up. What is it?
All right, we've got 2,800 people watching it. Let's get over 3,000 while we're still live tonight. So please share the stream. And a £48 super chat from Tom Cockcroft. Wow. Thank you very much. I love one where it's a precise figure. I like people who don't round up or round down. They say, I'm going to give you precisely £48 today. We've got 1K likes, so let's get those up as well.
Thank you so much, Tom.
For the last part of the show, we're going to talk about Keir Starmer. So we're going to address the controversial announcement he made over the weekend in a moment, which concerns Labour's policy on rent arrears. But first of all, just over an hour ago, he did a broadcast on the BBC. So this is quite a rare event, really, outside of an election time when you get to do a party political broadcast. Keir Starmer managed to get a 5-minute slot to basically do an alternative to what Boris Johnson did yesterday. So have a slot to broadcast his message to the whole country. We'll watch a bit of it here.
What we needed from the Prime Minister last night was clarity and reassurance. We needed to hear that nobody would be asked to go to work or send their children to school without it being safe to do so. We needed to know that the huge problems we've seen with protective equipment are over, that the crisis in our care homes has finally been gripped, that everybody who needs a test can finally get one. Above all, we need to know when we can see our loved ones again. The Prime Minister said he was setting out a roadmap, but if we're to complete the journey safely, a roadmap needs clear directions. So many of us have questions that need answering. How can we be sure our workplaces are now safe to return to? How can we get to work safely if we need public transport to do so? How can millions of people go back to work while balancing childcare and caring responsibilities?
So it was quite a big opportunity for Keir Starmer there. Potentially the first time many people have seen him as leader of the Labour Party. Kind of had a bit of a feeling of a Queen's speech, but I feel like we're getting used to those kind of semi-awkward but authoritative statements to the country. Aaron, what did you make of it? Did you think he took advantage of that 5 minutes to the full extent that he could have done?
I mean, it's hard, isn't it? Because I saw people say, oh, well, people tune out after 90 seconds. And we have to remember, this isn't just a clip on Twitter. You know, it goes out on BBC Radio 4. It's going out on the television. And so for radio, it made a lot more sense. For social media, I felt like it was 4.5 minutes long. I thought the first couple of minutes I thought were quite dull, quite boring, quite staid. But at the same time, you know, in the middle of the worst pandemic in a century, maybe a bit boring is quite good. You know, you don't want razzmatazz and populism. I thought the second half was really good when he talked about we can't go back to normal after this crisis. I thought it was excellent. To me, it was almost like two speeches just sort of squelched into one. So more of the second half and perhaps a little bit less of the first half. That said, you know, he's only 2 months into the job. You know, he could be a lot worse. Is he a populist? No. Is this an era of populism? Yes. However, and that was one of my criticisms of him. However, you know, with coronavirus, maybe at least in the short to medium term, that changes a little bit. Maybe increasingly that kind of personality, even to some people on the right, becomes a little bit more alluring. We'll see.
Okay, so Keir Starmer might be doing well at presenting an image which appears prime ministerial. He looks the part, and even though the public aren't gagging to vote Labour, according to the polls, they don't seem to dislike Keir Starmer. He seems to be fairly popular. But there is a problem, and it concerns policy. So Keir Starmer has announced 2 big policy changes since becoming leader. One of them was on Kashmir. So he sort of reversed Labour's support for self-determination of the Kashmiri people and said the constitutional issues of India should be purely an issue for the Indian Parliament, which is basically a pro-Modi position. What's that done? What that has done is piss off a lot of Labour Muslim voters. So there are 100 mosques who have now said they might encourage Muslims to abstain from voting Labour. Over the weekend, he's now pissed off another group of core Labour supporters, this time renters. That's because over the weekend, the party announced a 5-point plan for how to get out of any difficulties that renters might have during the coronavirus period. Some of it was fine. He was saying the Labour Party was saying we want to postpone and make sure no one can get evicted when lockdown ends, so sort of to give people more time. But the problem, to give people more time to find a solution, but the problem was the 4th pledge. Let's get this up. So this is from their press release. Once evictions are prevented, grant renters at least 2 years to pay back any arrears accrued during this period. And obviously, I mean, the problem here should be obvious, which is they are saying that if you are paying half rent during coronavirus, like many renters are, many people who are watching this probably are, because many people's incomes are down. He's saying that over the next 2 years, you are going to have to pay that back. So people who are already paying, say, 50% of their income, often in places like London, they're going to have to pay over and above that for the next 2 years whilst we're in the middle of an economic recession. It doesn't make any sense. There has been a big backlash, though. So over 5,000 Labour members, and remember, this was only announced 2 days ago, have now signed a petition to demand Labour cancel rent. I want to get up the 5 key demands from that, or 3 key demands, sorry. So they've gone for cancel at the tenant's request payments of rent for any tenant experiencing any drop in income, cover at the tenant's request utility payments for any tenant experiencing any drop in income, halt all eviction processes due to failure to produce rent until employment stabilizes. Now, I mean, we can debate each of those particular demands, how workable they are, but what Labour have done here is almost, it's worse than not committing to cancel the rent. I feel like I could understand why Keir Starmer might not stand up and say cancel the rent, but what Labour have done, unforced, is stand up and say our arrears, renters will have to pay them in full. So the costs of the coronavirus crisis will be entirely borne by renters, none by landlords. It seems completely bizarre. I'll go to Ash. Why do you think Keir Starmer is having such a massive problem with coming up with any kind of policy position that doesn't piss off a huge part of Labour's core support?
Well, I think that it was different in either case. I think with the Kashmir issue, it came from a lack of knowledge in the area and a lack of interest, and a general sense that what, Keir Starmer represents is the views of that very sizable chunk of the membership who wants to hold on to most of the economic policy from Corbyn and McDonnell, but is wary of the foreign policy stuff because of how toxified those debates became in the mainstream media. So I think that's where that particular error came from. I think when it came to the housing policy, there just was very little oversight of it. I think that perhaps, and I'm speculating here, what happened is that Thangam Debonair, in her new role as, shadow housing minister, was like, come up with a policy. This got put through, it goes out, and then suddenly there's a huge backlash because you're right, it is a terrible policy. And it doesn't need to be there, this element of, 2 years to pay rent arrears. It would be quite straightforward to suggest doing something like setting up a means-tested grant for genuinely struggling landlords, or reforming the housing benefit system to automatically top up shortfalls in income. These are things which would be relatively straightforward. I think the reason why that didn't happen is that there was a lack of consultation with tenants organisations such as the London Renters Union, with Acorn, and instead there was a great deal of time spent consulting with organisations which represent the interests of landlords. Now, that's not me speculating. There's a screenshot going around Twitter of a Zoom meeting of Thangam Debonair doing exactly that. Now, I think that with the backlash being what it is, the Labour Party will perhaps do a U-turn on this issue. But it's really important that precarious renters, tenants, make their voices heard, because Labour isn't the party of landlords. It's not the party of wealth. It's the party of workers. And I think that we do a very strange thing when it comes to landlords, is that we forget that landlords don't have a job, right? It's not a job. You are not charging for a service. You have an investment. And in all investments, your capital is at risk. So if I was going to buy some shares, it's obvious how many times I've done that before in my life by how scared I look when I'm talking about it. But if I was to buy some shares, I would not be entitled to my money being protected in the event of a decline in value of those shares. A house is the same. It is an investment, and market forces, sometimes the value of your investment drops as well as increases, in particular if you're facing a decimation of household incomes like we're facing now with the COVID-19 crisis. And even if being a landlord was a job, and, I fully acknowledge the fact that not every single landlord is like that, baby-faced 20-something billionaire Grosvenor. That one? No chin to speak of. Not all landlords are in that situation. Maybe they've got a live-in lodger or something of that nature. And maybe they do see it as a full-time job. Well, the rest of the workforce has had to get by on 80% of their income up to a value of £2,500 a month. So if it's a job, why aren't you having to take the same level of income support that everyone else is? And if it's an investment, why isn't your capital genuinely at risk? It seems to me to be absurd that the material interest of the rentier class would be protected by a Labour government, by a Labour policy, better than any other category of either investor or worker. That's insane.
Aaron, I'm going to go to you in 1 minute, but first of all, what I want to do is play Keir Starmer's response to this. So he was asked precisely, this question, why he was protecting landlords over renters on LBC today, and this is what he said.
If all rents are suspended, full stop, then the government will have to pay to compensate landlords. There's no question about that. And therefore, public money will be paid to landlords to compensate for the fact they haven't got rent, even where people don't lose their jobs. So what we've said, the better option is if somebody does lose their job, which is tragic, and I certainly hope you don't, then the benefit system should be paying the rent at a better rate. So in other words, if you carry on and you're still in your job and you can pay your rent, then there's no reason for the government to pay the landlord. If, unfortunately, you lose your job and the state can then step in with benefits to pay the rent, because I don't want anybody to put in the position you've described. But at the moment, to simply say all rent is suspended and that means there's no income to landlords for 2 years or whatever it may be, it is inevitable, we've looked at this before, that the state will then have to compensate all landlords. So then we'll be paying out to landlords, in some cases, for people who've kept their jobs and could have paid their rent.
What do you make of that defence, Aaron?
He doesn't know what he's talking about. Because, it's not about will you keep your job or lose your job. What if your hours are reduced? What if you go on the furlough scheme, right? What if you've moved from one job to another, you're earning slightly less? You had a good stable job in financial services and now you're working at Tesco. So it betrays to me a fundamental lack of knowledge about people's lived experiences. And the fact that he's talking about, complete rent suspension, rent forgiveness is the only alternative. The fact he's using that straw man argument betrays the reality of the weakness of the very argument Labour have instilled within this utterly ridiculous policy. I think per month, the entire rental sector, I think, is about £6-7 billion. You could have a system whereby you'd say to renters, you pay 1/3, the state will pay 1/3, and the landlord takes a haircut on 1/3, i.e. they lose that money. Sorry. And like you say, how different is that to the furlough scheme where ultimately workers only get 80% up to £2,500 for 3 months, right? That would cost the government a couple of billion a month. The furlough scheme costs about 10 billion a month. Now, even if you're giving people, now bear in mind, Labour, just from a political expediency point of view, renters are the number one a group of people to vote Labour. So in launching a perceived attack on renters and in really making a major misstep over Kashmir, Labour have alienated two of their core sources of sort of support, electoral support: Muslims, BAME communities, and renters. It's just a really stupid thing to do in the context of entering the worst recession in 300 years. So even if you are a renter, and even if actually you haven't lost your job, guess what? Those people could really do with an increase of, say, £1,000 that just happens to go in their back pocket over the next couple of months. Because often what happens with helicopter money in rentier economies is that ends up with landlords. That ends up with people extracting rents. And you would have to think and formulate of a way of doing the helicopter money with it getting to ordinary people. Because guess who's most likely to spend, who's most likely to boost aggregate demand in a downturn? It's renters, it's people on lower incomes. Why? Because they need more stuff, right? If I'm a multi-billionaire, I'm not necessarily going to be buying 2 pints of milk rather than one, because, I might buy more on positional goods, things like I want that mansion by the sea rather than that mansion half a mile down the road. But in terms of the core basics that people need to subsist, electricity, maybe certain leisure goods, clothes, food, working class people are going to be leading that increase in final demand for the economy. So there is absolutely no argument against even, yes, somebody who's renting. What's the big deal if they get an extra grand out of this? If we have a quasi-furlough scheme for rent for 3 or 4 months, nobody's suggesting 2 years. Nobody is suggesting complete rent forgiveness for 2 years. The fact Keir Starmer is saying that on LBC shows it's a stupid policy, and fundamentally it's indefensible.
Yeah, I mean, I should probably have said that the question did mention unemployment, which is one of the reasons why he was bringing it up so much. But you are 100% right that the party, Fangam Debonair, and this guy Nearly Legal, who claims to have sort of advised on the policy, to defend the policy, all they can do is make straw mans. So they can say, yeah, go on, Ash.
Can I ask, why is his Nearly Legal?
Yeah, when you're a lawyer, you should be wholly legal, right?
Well, it's not just that, because Barely Legal was about people who've just aged up into the age of consent, but Nearly Legal implies being under that age.
I want to go to
do you know what I mean?
It's weird.
I hadn't thought of that, but it's true. It's kind of weird. If we had, if we were we should probably give the introduction to the audience. So yeah, the guy who is advising Labour on this policy on Twitter is called @NearlyLegal, which, yeah, as Ash says, is a pretty odd handle to have. Can I just say one more thing?
Yeah, go on.
This is what happens when you get lawyers to make policy in a context of the biggest economic recession in the history of capitalism. Maybe it might be a good idea to get somebody who knows, political economy and deficits. And, he's talking, well, if you spend this money here, you don't get to spend it on the NHS. We're about to see GDP contract by 14%, right? The more it contracts, the lower the tax take, the less you can spend on public services. Okay. So we want to boost public demand. And one way of doing that is giving renters money. So fewer lawyers making policy, please, more political economists. And hey, why don't we even consult the renters themselves? Save a lot of hassle.
I mean, that's a really good point as well, because I think one thing that characterizes this announcement by the Labour Party is sort of accepting a version of capitalist realism that no one needs to accept in this point of time. They're saying, oh, well, if people owe the rent, of course they've got to pay the rent. Of course they've got to. How else could it possibly work? And that just displays an absolute lack of imagination. And I want to go to a policy proposal from the New Economics Foundation, who have displayed some imagination. And also, these aren't just, these aren't people who don't think about policy, who are just saying, oh, here's a great slogan we could have. They're at the New Economics Foundation. They know what they're talking about, and this is what they suggest. So in order to avoid plunging renters into financial hardship and potentially triggering an eviction crisis following the pandemic, we are proposing a UK-wide suspension of rents and mortgage freeze. These measures would have no significant additional cost to the government, although Bank of England loans would need to be made available for banks to cover lost liquidity from mortgage payments, and some landlords may need to rely on the job retention schemes. That's a very ambitious and imaginative proposal. As we've said, the only alternative to Labour's current policy isn't actually rent cancellation. So you don't have to be as ambitious as this. But what they are pointing out is that there is an alternative to renters paying all the rent. And it's not just the state suddenly stepping up and paying all the rent, which would be very expensive, even though you probably could justify that in a time of crisis. You can be imaginative and say, if to all of these landlords you guarantee that they won't have any mortgage charges for that period, and it's sort of put in the long grass, and you can spread these fees over the 25 years that the mortgage lasts for, then no one actually has to pay rent that month. And if someone is living off their job as a landlord, which, I mean, we don't think is a particularly valuable, contribution to society, but also we don't want coronavirus to put people into poverty. They're saying they can have a version of the furlough scheme, which is if the house you rent out is your main form of income, you can get 80% of your income like everyone else. And all they're saying to make sure this doesn't develop into a banking crisis is you do a bit more QE, which is the government are printing lots of money and giving it to banks all the time in this crisis. So there is a way out, which doesn't mean condemning renters to pay an extra £100 or £200 a month, which they can barely afford in good economic times, let alone a 2-year recession. And the fact that the Labour Party haven't even considered this, have just rejected it out of hand, I think is phenomenal in this period of time.
And also, I've been hearing from a lot of my friends who have suffered huge reductions in their incomes during this crisis, and how difficult it's been when their landlord doesn't want to personally take on the mortgage holiday. So there's no legal guarantee of them passing on a deferral in their mortgage payments onto their tenants. And when they've made the case of, we've paid you, 50 grand or something already, and, yes, it means that you won't get our money for, this period of months, but that just means that you have to rent it out for longer than you'd planned to, and you still get an asset at the end of it. Unless you've got some kind of, statutory obligation there's no reason for landlords to make things easier on their tenants, other than banking on the goodness of their own heart. But that's not how you can run an economy. That's not how you can secure people's housing. And it just seems to me to be completely insane for the Labour Party to take a view which is, as Aaron pointed out, economically illiterate, but also disavows their own power as legislators. Nearly legal needs a new fucking handle. But his job is to interpret laws. It's the role of legislators to make the laws. So why operate within pre-existing constraints and the constraints which have produced this deeply unequal system that we're now seeing, the dreadful fruit of right now?
Let's go to, there's a relevant question which I'm going to go to before going to you, Aaron, for some final points. First of all, we've got a £49 super chat from Anska Sanskus. They say, very interesting, thank you. Very kind. As I say, I love it when they're exact figures. Act Up for Good with a £27 super chat asks, would it kill you to compliment Starmer? think chess, not checkers. And I assume the implication of that second part of the question is to say, if we were fairer to Starmer, potentially, over the long term, that means that you can shift him in a positive direction. I'll go to you, Aaron, in a second. But first of all, I think we're quite fair to Keir Starmer. I mean, before this section on this terrible rent policy, we discussed his video to the country talking about Labour's alternative to the coronavirus crisis and said it was quite good. I mean, he looked prime ministerial. He's quite popular in the public. I do think that he could be a bit more bold in terms of saying Labour has an alternative, not just Labour has questions. But I mean, we're not out here to just trash Keir Starmer, but when they announce a terrible policy, we will trash the terrible policy.
I mean, this is also why all of you should be signed up to listen to The Burner every morning and to receive the Cortado every Friday, because I did an episode about Keir Starmer last week and also wrote a bit about him for the Cortado. And one of the things that I said is that it's going to be difficult for the left in particular to see Keir Starmer clearly because of the long shadow of Jeremy Corbyn. And I'm not talking about the negative sense. I'm saying that Jeremy Corbyn redefined what we expect from a Labour leader, right? He was totemic. He had stood up for these causes for 40 years. He had distinguished himself through a moral clarity, a sense of insurgency, and also integrity. And so everyone was pretty clear about who he was. Now, being able to get a grip on him in that way also meant that it was, I think, easier for his opponents to choose his strengths and attack them relentlessly. So you traduce the very virtues which brought him to prominence in the first place. And I think that's a big part of what ended up happening in 2019. In comparison, I think Keir Starmer is a cipher. So he's probably had a look at what's happened to, every Labour leader since Gordon Brown, who's had to kind of tough out, either the entirety of or a majority of a full parliamentary term. Gordon Brown limps into the 2010 election mortally wounded by the expenses scandal, by Northern Rock, and, in that latter home stretch, Bigot Gate as well. You've got Ed Miliband, who in some ways you can see has got these aspects of what Keir Starmer's doing now. He was beloved by the lobby, so he was able to sort of frame interventions and calibrate them in such a way that, it's kind of a handful of Westminster journalists were kind of really vibing with him. But he didn't get that sense of cut through to the country because he wasn't seen as being distinct enough from David Cameron. And he was also smeared and traduced for being anti-British. There were some overtones of anti-Semitism there as well. Jeremy Corbyn, 2017, is able to defy expectations, right? Completely, even his opponents would say completely defy expectations in 2017 general election. 2019, it felt like this horrible, coming to fruition of all of those seeds of, smears and undermining and undercutting, as well as, genuine failures and flaws in political strategy. So that's a very difficult, set of three leaders to follow. What are you supposed to do? And so I think Keir Starmer's approach is don't peak too soon. If you really want to tough it out to the next general election, definitely don't peak too soon. Take the approach of a Clement Attlee figure. So behave as though you are already in a government of national unity without actually being in a government of national unity. So you don't come across as too obstructive. You don't play into, these bickering politicians, blah, blah, blah. And then you kind of inherit a landscape which is more conducive to a Labour policy platform. I think that's his strategy. And it remains to be seen whether or not it will work in the long term. In the short to medium term, you can see his very favourable personal polling. And that shows that perhaps, he's been able to shrug off some of the toxicity which would have accompanied anyone else who'd gone from Jeremy Corbyn's shadow cabinet to leader of the opposition. It means that he's sort of been able to remove himself from that public perception. But it's not doing all that well for Labour in the polls immediately. There's not that kind of new leader poll bounce that you would expect. And also, in the short to medium term, we expect concessions from the government, right? The very people who make up your party membership, the people who make up your voters, people who need Labour to stand up vociferously for working people in the legislative process. They need concessions. The furlough scheme was a concession, including self-employed people in income protection was a concession. And it happened because John McDonnell put on his big boy boots and went out to kick some heads. And it worked. You know, it wasn't because he needled the Conservative Party. It's because, you know, he went studs up. And so there are, I think, some difficult choices to make about this sort of long-term goal, not wanting to peak too soon, not wanting to go into an election overexposed, but then also the short and medium-term aims of meeting this crisis and representing the very people who you claim to stand up for. So that's me being fair to Keir Starmer. That's my Keir Starmer take, right? He's a cipher. Corbyn was a totem.
Can I just add a few points?
Yeah,
the first is, you know, he hasn't got a chief economic advisor. He hasn't got one of the very first few appointments you should have had, which is really worrying because his head of policy comes out of a comms policy background, but they don't come out of an economics background. That's the first thing. Secondly, actually, you said so much that I wanted to say, but I think this is a really important point. Secondly, if you look at what Keir Starmer is trying to do, yes, there's the consensus element, but it presumes that he's going to keep the 10.3 million votes that Labour got last December. That's just being presumed. It's being locked in. And when you think that Gordon Brown got 8.5 million in 2010, why? Because a lot of people went to the Lib Dems. When you think Ed Miliband got 9.5 million in 2015, why? Because lots of people went to the SNP and the Green Party and also UKIP. You can't just presume that those votes are in the bank. It could be you make screw-ups like Kashmir, you lose the BAME vote. It could be the Lib Dems get a reasonably left-wing leader and you lose young people in university towns and cities to Layla Moran. And all of a sudden you have a really big challenge there. So I think this, we'll try and win this in 2, 3, 4 years. I think it's concerning because that means you're taking the people you already have for granted. And I think that's really, really unwise. So I'm not that optimistic about the strategy overall. I don't think it's a particularly clever one. And I think he should be trying to, I think the polite thing, the bickering thing, I agree with you, Ash, you want to lean into that, lean into the credible prime ministerial guy. But I also think as well, this is really important. Probably we disagree about this, Michael, you and I. The personal ratings thing, I mean, it's welcome. You don't want bad ratings. But Barack Obama had the best personal approval ratings of any president ever in the US. They lost 2 midterms and they lost down ballot races for 8 years, right? What would happen with the Labour Party that comes to power purely on the personal approval ratings of Keir Starmer? Would that help local councils? Would that help Labour win mayoralties? Would it mean you have an enduring political project? No. It's the idea that you're going to build a political project to transform this country on the basis of one guy's approval ratings. I can tell you now, and we have to wait another 4 years until the next general election, that is doomed to failure.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for your super chats tonight. And thank you, everyone who donates to us, not via super chats, directly on the website. If you want to become a subscriber, go to novaramedia.com/support. We appreciate it so much. Unfortunately, we don't have any time for any more questions. We've done a few. I'll be back on Wednesday night. Aaron Bastani is back tomorrow. He's going to be interviewing
Leo Panich.
Great. I just wanted to double check that. You've been watching Tiski Sour on Novara Media. Good night.